Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In this video, I'm going to show you how to secure a REST API using IAM Auth. I will use AWS API Gateway via AWS console to configure the security for the API endpoint. With microservice architecture dominating the integration technology, there are millions of APIs out there. Some APIs are used in private network by internal application and some are offered in public platform. It is essential that these API endpoints are protected so that only authorized consumers can have access to these. Let's look at the architecture design here. In the first diagram, we have an API endpoint, which is invoking a Lambda function. Lambda is getting the data from DynamoDB and returning the response back to the API. This is an unsecure endpoint. It's not protected by any API security. But the second diagram here is the same API endpoint to get the task from the DynamoDB, but it is protected by the IAM Auth. IAM Auth is one of the many ways that REST API endpoint can be secured to prevent unauthorized access to the API. Basic authentication using username and password, JWT, OAuth2 are few other mechanisms that can be implemented to secure the API endpoint depending on the use case. I will use AWS IAM Auth to secure the API endpoint in this workshop. Prereq for this is having a DynamoDB table that has the task data, Lambda function, and IAM credential, the access key and secret key that is needed to pass into the header when invoking the API. I already have a DynamoDB table with some data in it. If you want to learn about creating DynamoDB table using AWS SAM and AWS CloudFormation, please watch my video on this workshop. Link is in the description. I also have a Lambda function created which will be used to integrate with API endpoint. If you want to learn about creating and testing Lambda function, please watch my video on Lambda workshop. Link is in the description for this as well. For this workshop, I'm going to use AWS console to create API endpoint for the Lambda function. I will then enable IAM Auth on this endpoint to make it a secure API. Let's get started. We're going to create a REST API GET endpoint, validate the endpoint using Postman, and will then add the API IAM Auth to secure the API endpoint and validate it again using Postman. First step is log into AWS console and search for API Gateway service. API Gateway is the service to build, deploy, and manage API. Let's create a REST API. There are many options you will see. There is the HTTP API, WebSocket, REST. I'm going to create a REST API. So select the REST and click on build. We'll provide a name for the API. I'm going to name this API Demo Task API. Let's create a resource next. I'm going to name this resource as all task. This is the resource that need to be part of your API endpoint URL. Next, we will create a method. So I'm creating a get method here, and then we're gonna proxy it via Lambda function. Like I stated, I already have a Lambda function created, so I'm simply linking the Lambda function here with my get method. From the drop down, I selected the get method and linked it with the Lambda function here. I'm going to leave the default timeout as 29 seconds. Now the API endpoint is created, however, it's not secure. Authorization is required, is shown as none, as you can see here. Next, I need to deploy this API. Before we can use it, it's essential to deploy the API. So I'm going to deploy the API Once API is deployed, I'll get the endpoint. Let's make a note of this endpoint because this is the endpoint that I will use to invoke the API. Let's test this endpoint to ensure that it is indeed fetching the record using the get API endpoint. I'm going to use Postman to test this endpoint. As you can see, I'm getting my required get content in the response. It's a insecure API. It's not protected by any API security method. So all the data is being displayed in the response. Now let's make this API endpoint secure so that only authorized client can have access to this API. We're going to go back to our API screen. We're going to click and update the authorization. From none, we're going to select to AWS IAM. And once we made this change, let's deploy the API again after making the updates. Now I'm going to go back to the Postman, pass the same URL, the API endpoint, and click send. And as you can see, this time I'm not getting the response back. There is no data being returned by the API. Rather, I'm getting a message that is missing the authentication token. This is the expected behavior because now this API is secure. And until I provide the authentication in the header, API will not return me any response. We're going to pass the IAM Auth in the header, and let's try it again, invoking the API. I'm passing the access key and secret key because it's the IAM Auth. So let's pass it. And as you can see, it worked this time. For IAM Auth in the header, access key and secret key was passed. Once we have successfully validated the API security, let's clean up the resources, delete the DynamoDB table, delete the Lambda function, delete API, and delete your access key, secret key created for this workshop. This is just so you don't incur any unneeded cost for your AWS account. With this workshop, a REST API has been created and endpoint has been secured using IAM Auth. Consumers will need to pass required IAM Auth access key and secret key in the header to invoke this API. There are other ways to secure API as well, like JWT, OAuth, and API key. We will explore these ways in another workshop. Hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. I'm working on some other interesting content on various AWS topics. These will be posted soon. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.